So I just want to welcome everybody, whether you're from OLA or from beyond OLA. This gathering was originally scheduled for an in-person gathering at the end of March. And so when everything happened with the pandemic, I was able to contact Blythe and ask if she'd be willing to do this on Zoom. And thankfully, she said yes, because I think it's it's actually a very important night for us, certainly at OLA and from wherever you're coming from, to just take this time to pause and consider this incredible woman who was both very controversial in the church as well as in her own neighborhood and society. And she ends up being this kind of imperfectly perfect role model, and now is being raised up for canonization as well within the Catholic Church. I guess many of you know this, but in 2015, when Pope Francis came to America, he went and gave a speech to Congress, and he said, "I'm convinced that we can make a difference." That's what he wanted to tell Congress. And then he called on Congress to remember the high ideals of the American culture and politics, citing these values like justice and equal rights and liberty and peace. And then he goes on to mention 4 important Americans who he sees as following these ideals and following their own dreams of making America a better place to live. And he mentions Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and then he mentions 2 Catholics, Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. So tonight, we want to hear about Dorothy Day, and thankfully we have an expert to help us with that. But before we get to that, I just a very brief bit of housekeeping. First off, I want to mention now, in case I forget later or we run low on time later, I want to just give a thank you to Kathy and Ralph Williams from our parish at OLA here, who really know Blythe and introduced me to Blythe and really facilitated this whole thing. So if not for them, this really wouldn't be happening tonight. So I want to thank Kathy and Ralph. The other bit of housekeeping is just to kind of how we'll proceed tonight. So after a brief introduction of Blythe, then I have some questions that I have prepared that I'll ask Blythe, and I think we'll get a very good understanding of Dorothy Day and the work that she's done. And then we're going to leave some time for you to ask some questions too. Hopefully we'll have enough time for a nice chunk of questions there. And at that time, when we get there, we'll kind of give you a chance to unmute, and we'll get you back on video if you're not on video, and we'll have some time for that. We've got Deacon Chris Thompson here. If you got on a little bit later, I mentioned him before, but he's here to help us with a lot of our techno problems. If you're having issues, he'll be kind of in the background there, checking in and looking for any glitches that may be going on. So that's a lot to do, and it's in 1 hour. We want to end at 8 o'clock. So let's get to it. This new book, it's a new book entitled Dorothy Day, Dissenting Voice of the American Century, is co-authored by Blythe Randolph and John Loughery. And I guess I'll say a brief word about John first, who's not here, the co-author, and then I'll give you a more detailed introduction of the second person of that writing duo, our guest tonight. So John Loughery is a teacher, art critic, historian, and Pulitzer Prize nominated and Edgar Award winning biographer based in New York City. He's written a lot of biographies, and Blythe will probably say more about him too, and the process that they did working together on this, but substantial contribution by him. And as well as our second author, who is with us tonight. Blythe Randolph, a native of Richmond, Virginia, educated at Hollins College and University of Virginia. She moved to New York City and lived there for 30 years, working in book and magazine publishing. And then during her time in New York, Blythe wrote two young adult biographies, one about Amelia Earhart and another about Charles Lindbergh. She left publishing while in New York and began working in the field of development, employed by Columbia Medical Center and the International Center for the Disabled. And then she and her husband, Dr. Stephen Roser, moved to Atlanta, where Blythe became the vice president for development at Zoo Atlanta. Having a long-standing fascination with Dorothy Day, Blythe took early retirement from Zoo Atlanta and set out to write a full-length biography on Day. And Blythe, I think, really offers an important and fresh take on Day's life and the Catholic worker movement, writing from both a female perspective and also a non-Catholic perspective. So delighted to have her here. Blythe, on behalf of the community at OLA and everyone else joining us this evening, I want to extend a warm and grateful welcome to you for being here.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here.
Well, we're delighted you're here. I wonder if you could start maybe by just giving us a little bit of maybe background on you. You know, how does a chief development officer of Zoo Atlanta come to write a biography on Dorothy Day?
Well, I had written, as you said, I had written two books for the young adult audience on Earhart and Lindbergh. And I always hoped to get back into writing, but quite frankly, my jobs got more and more all-consuming, and it was very hard to do both. But my husband was kind enough a few years ago to let me take early retirement so I could focus on doing this. And I thought that I wanted to write about Dorothy, but I actually spent, maybe 6 or 8 months at least, in the early days of my retirement, doing research on her for two reasons. Obviously, to have a body of information, but also to make sure that the life that she led would be interesting enough to me that because I knew this was going to be a long-term project, and I wanted to make sure that I wouldn't bore out, if you will. And I have to say that while I sometimes got very bored with the process and certainly got very bored with me, I luckily never got bored with Dorothy. So it turned out to be a fascinating project to work on.
Well, so tell us more about Dorothy Day. Some of us have heard of her, some of us know a lot about her, some of us are just really being introduced to her. What was it that intrigued you, and what can you tell us about who she was as a person and what she really ended up doing, just kind of as a general thing? And of course, we'll get into more within some of the other questions, but just give us a little general background on her, if you would.
Okay. Well, first I should probably say that one of the thing that sort of led me into being interested in her is that I have always had an interest in some of the socially progressive movements between about 1900 and the Second World War, for their own sakes, of course, but also because many of them were instigated by women, not legislated, but instigated by women. Eleanor Roosevelt being a prime example, but there were lots of other people. And while I was learning about some of the social movements, I kept hearing about this woman who wanted, in terms of social justice, wanted many of the things that these other women wanted, much of which morphed into the New Deal. But she was going about it in a very, very different way. And then I learned a little bit about her personal life, and I was really fascinated. She began life as a young journalist in the 19 teens and into the 20s. And she worked for a lot of radical publications, several radical publications. And she led for the time a kind of freewheeling life. She had several affairs. She had at least one abortion, a suicide attempt. She entered into what was effectively a common law marriage with a man she deeply loved. And they had a child together. And then she had always had some interest in religion, but she became, after the birth of her daughter, much more interested in it. And she ended up having her daughter baptized, and then some months later, becoming a Catholic herself, which meant that she had to leave the man that was the father of her daughter, because he did not believe in the institution of marriage. He loved her very much, but he saw no purpose in institutions, particularly the Catholic Church. And they finally had to go their separate ways, although he always stayed involved with their daughter. So they didn't completely separate, but they could no longer live together. And it was a great sadness in her life, because she had loved him so deeply. And she was kind of floundering for a few years after her conversion. But then she met up with a gentleman named Peter Morin. And Peter was a kind of vagabond philosopher, but was just an incredible reader, and really got her, even more than she had heretofore, got her reading theology and philosophy. And he was convinced that they should start a movement, which became the Catholic Worker Movement. And it really had at least three parts. The first part was a newsletter, which is still being printed today, and still costs a penny a copy, as it did in 1933. And then they developed on the Lower East Side of New York. They developed a house of hospitality, which was basically a soup kitchen. Of course, this was the middle of the Depression, so there were an awful lot of people who were going hungry. There are now 150 of these homes across the United States, and another 40 or so overseas. So that movement is still going on. And then finally, Dorothy spent a great deal of time on the road, going places, protesting, periodically getting thrown in jail, because she disagreed so ardently on so many social justice issues with what was going on. And people in the Catholic Worker are still protesting. I was intrigued to know that when the Pope was here, there were a lot of Catholic workers that showed up in Washington to protest what we were doing in the Middle East, so that he could see that. She spent roughly 50 years involved in this work. And in the 40 years since her death, that work still goes on, not always exactly the way it was done in 1933, but lots of people are still involved with the Catholic Worker Movement.
Beautiful. You mentioned Day's conversion and how and where this all ended up, but it certainly was not a straight line for her. She's running around the Lower East Side and the Lower West Side in the 20s and 30s. She's hanging around with a lot of socialists and communists and atheists and all the ists. And then there's this, seems anyway from the book too, that this religious sensibility was always there somehow, was tugging at her, was nagging at her. And
a very early age, she had some interest in religion. And she was sort of, I think at certain points when she was hanging out with the socialists and the communists, she kind of was a little careful about following that in certain ways. And there were when she did ultimately convert, there were lots of people from her early days that simply could not understand why she would have moved in that direction. And that was a source of significant distance between her and some of her former comrades, if you will.
And yet she seemed so sure about it. I mean, is it fair to say that whatever she was exploring in those earlier years really was kind of close, but not exactly it, until she really came to at least the kind of Catholicism that she understood in terms of its engagement with social issues and her conversion, that really was.
Well, it's a good point. She always said that it was the birth of her child, that because she had had an abortion, and deeply regretted that all of her life, that she had been afraid that the abortion might have rendered her sterile, and that when she was able to get pregnant and have this child, she was so grateful that she had been given that gift, that was the sort of, although it had been happening up to that point, that was really the sort of catalyst for the conversion. She wanted it for herself and she wanted it for her daughter. So I think it was a significant change. I mean, it is a very, as conversions often are, it was a totally different life that she embraced after that, and went to went to Mass every day. Always was very, although she disagreed with the Catholic hierarchy in lots and lots of ways, she considered herself a devout daughter of the church. And she always maintained, because she was often in trouble with the local clergy for certain things that she did and said and wrote. And she was always being talked to by somebody who said, you got to turn it down a little bit, that kind of thing. But she always maintained that in spite of the fact that she often seemed to be pulling in a different direction, she maintained that if they had ever told her, you must, as a daughter of this faith, you must discontinue your work with the Catholic workers, she always said that she would have done that, but luckily they never asked her for that.
They did, was it Cardinal Spellman, who wanted her to drop the word Catholic out of Catholic worker at some point?
Yes. And she but she didn't say no. She said, I have to talk to others. Mm-hmm. And then she came back and she kind of blamed it on the other people. Why she didn't think that could happen. Yeah. But it was rare that she would actually say no. She tried to work with them. Her basic issue with the hierarchy was that she didn't believe they cared enough for poor people, that they were far more involved with the constituency that could support the church, and they didn't give enough time and attention to people who could not. Yeah. Of course, that her mission was so different from that.
And you know, and you can see this in her life too, that as she's getting more deeply into her own faith and post-conversion, she's also uncovering the teachings that are in the church on social justice. And she has Peter Morin who's basically schooling her on all that every day, right? As they're working, he's going on about the teachings. I wanted to read something from the book. It's in the introduction, but I think it sort of goes to this point about how she could sort of stay inside and still be critical and still be devoted. So this is from your introduction of the book. She, Day, came to believe that the true objects of devotion in Western culture, security, affluence, national pride, and enthrallment to innovation and technology were the real sources of our undoing as a moral society. And she was impatient with anyone who made religion seem reassuring rather than demanding and transcendent. The New Testament called on all believers to fight racism, war, and poverty, or it meant nothing at all. That's pretty convicted of somebody who, you know, was looking around for a time, and now she seems very clear, and kind of has her marching orders.
Well, she had what I would call a kind of big biblical approach. For example, she was a great, one of her favorite biblical passages was found in Matthew 25, which also resonates strongly with me. I'm not the most religious person in the world, but I love that passage. Mm. And those who might not connect entirely with that, it's according to Matthew, Christ says to his disciples, feed the hungry, give drink to those who thirst, cover the naked, comfort the sick and the afflicted, welcome the stranger, and even visit those who are in prison. And Christ goes on to say, and if you will do these things for the least of mine, you do them for me. And I think that is the core of her belief and what got her out of bed every day to go and do the things that she did. She believed she was following Christ's instructions.
And she was calling it out when she saw that the church in particular was not, and maybe other parts of society as well. And so she was confrontational in that sense, right? Calling us to this higher order that doesn't always go over very well, especially if you're speaking to people who are not in that position. They're not always necessarily. So I'm struck by her confrontational nature, and yet it's not in a criticizing kind of way that's making a judgment. Well, she's making a judgment, I guess, but she's willing to go on the front lines herself and turn it around. And she demanded that of anybody who worked with her, right? They lived in poverty, did they not?
They did. It's a very different model than the kind of model that had been developed in the settlement house movement. And there were some wonderful people. I mean, Jane Addams and people like that did wonderful, wonderful work, but they didn't necessarily live on the same level as the people they were trying to help. The worker movement, if you were going to be part of the worker movement, you lived in poverty. You had some food. You could get clothes out of the charity barrel, but there were no salaries. You just you lived with these people. And it had to be, sometimes I think it must have been so difficult because you were living in, the house was not as clean as it should have been. You had virtually no privacy. People would be wandering around the hallways, as homeless people often are, a little crazy, talking to themselves. Occasionally you were threatened. It was there were lice, there were bed bugs. It was really a very difficult place to live, because you didn't go in and work for 8 or 9 hours and then go to some comfortable existence. You were expected to be there and to live, if not in the house, kind of nearby. You were supposed to be poor. That was part of the deal.
Those conditions sound like my son's dorm room. Why was that? Why was that important to her? That if you were going to work with the poor, that in effect you became poor, or you, not that you had to become poor, but you had to live with the poor.
Well, she didn't want there to be a distance. She didn't want there to be a separation between the people that were attempting to help and the poor that they were trying to help. She wanted them to experience the same conditions because she thought that would make them more empathic toward the people that they were trying to help. And she felt that that was in the biblical way to go about this.
So that there wasn't this kind of, I'm the giver and you're the receiver, and therefore I'm above in some way. I've got something and you don't.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
yes.
I don't know if you would see this as related. I'm interested though. One of the things that in reading your book, especially, that just kind of the real takeaway for me was, for me, this term, I guess it was already in play. It wasn't like she invented this, but this idea of personalism. I wonder if you could say more about that, this concept, and maybe even, what did she mean by that when she saw and used this term personalism with regard to this?
Well, she was taught the term by Peter Morin. And it was a movement that had started in France, and he had brought it with him to the United States. And the idea was that that you didn't look to the government. And this is where she really stands apart from the New Deal women and that sort of thing. You didn't look to the government to solve society's problems. You looked to yourself. If you had 2 coats, you should give one away. If you had 2 pairs of shoes, you should give one away. We were responsible. And she felt that anytime that the government got involved, it took the onus off the individual to help those in need. So she was not in any sense a New Dealer. And in fact, in one sense, you could almost say that the political party that she most closely aligns with currently is the Libertarian Party. But of course, her ideas about social justice and everything, they sort of veer toward the liberal side. I think it was the writer Gary Wills who said that no matter what side of the political spectrum you fell, there was something about Dorothy that would irritate you. Really true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like she didn't want us to shirk our own direct responsibility by saying, well, go to, I mean, I wrote this quote from the PBS biography, that little documentary they did, which was, I thought was very good. And they ask her, this is a 1971 interview. She responds, if your brother is hungry, you feed him. You don't meet him at the door and say, go be thou filled, or wait for a few weeks and you'll get a welfare check. You sit him down and you feed him. And that's how the soup kitchen started.
Yes, yes.
That really says it. And it's we're each called individually, maybe not to be working a soup kitchen or something, exactly like that, but we all have some part to play.
Yes. And I think, if you'll forgive an editorial comment, I sort of had an objective with this. And one of the things that really drew me to the subject matter wasn't because I thought I was going to go out and start a movement. I'm not, anyone who knows me well knows I am not that person. But I did hope that people learning about her would decide that they could do a little more than they're currently doing. That they would be inspired to, if they had the capacity to write a bigger check, that they would think about doing that. If they had, let's say, a retiree who doesn't have a lot of discretionary income, but might have more time on their hands, might be inspired to volunteer somewhere a couple of hours a week. I have really hoped that, because I think we could all do a little more than we're doing. And I hope that the book would make people want to do that.
Mm. Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, certainly was inspirational for me. As a good Catholic, I also feel terribly guilty when I'm reading about her. That she did all this stuff in her life. What am I doing? Yeah.
Well, that's why the Vatican is looking at her.
What's that?
But well, that's why the Vatican is looking at her and not at us.
Exactly. Yes. Well, what would she say about becoming a saint?
Well, she was very tart about that, as she was about many things. And in fact, there was a documentary, not the one you saw recently, but a few years ago, that took this a remark of hers as its title, which was "Don't Call Me a Saint." And she was famous for saying that. She said, "I don't want to be dismissed that easily." Because again, it comes back to the idea that if we say, oh, well, she's a saint, she does these things, then that takes the onus off us, because we're not saints, so we don't have to do what she did. She wanted for her actions to not be seen as something that was extraordinary. She felt that this was the job of everyone to do it. But of course, most of us are not going to do that. We're not going to live the way she lived. But the question becomes, could we do a little more than we're currently doing?
Right, and it doesn't always have to be so dramatic either. We can do that in our everyday life. We don't have to move somewhere else for that. Or
exactly.
Blythe, before I want to open it up to folks who are in attendance here for some questions too, but I guess maybe before we do that, just kind of an open-ended thing is, before we turn it over, is there anything else about Dorothy Day's life and her work that you think that we should know that I haven't asked about? Or
well, one thing, we're talking about her perhaps at some point in the future becoming a saint, but I think one of the things that I was very intrigued by is that she wasn't always terribly saintly in terms of the way she operated. I always think of the story that there was a woman who used to come in the early days of the worker and would bring checks or old clothes or something, and she would come on a regular basis, and she just worshipped Dorothy, thought she hung the moon. And one day she was there and said, "Oh, Miss Day, do you have visions?" And Dorothy took a cigarette out of her mouth and said, "Hell no. The only visions I have are of unpaid bills." And I just loved that, because that's the kind of saint I could get behind. Cigarette and all.
Beautiful. Thank you, Boy. Let's open it up to folks. Maybe we get a little help from Chris here too. If you can start your videos, because I'm not sure we're going to have an option to raise a virtual hand, so we'll have to have you wave at us.
Can I ask a question since I'm on? I just curious. Thank you so much for your presentation. Can you talk any more about what her prayer life was like that somehow supported all this she did?
Well, she was famous for saying at certain points when people would get so discouraged, you know, when things would not go well at the house or not go well on the road. And something that she said frequently was, we can always pray. That when things were disappointing, when she wasn't making the progress that she wanted, she said, we can pray unceasingly. And I think that was a very important part of her life. I think it's incredibly, I think it's one of the things that kept her going, because the life was tough. I mean, she had, I I couldn't have done it for 50 days, much less 50 years. And I think prayer was a big part of what got her going to every day to do what she needed to do, and sustained her during the difficult times. And there were so many difficult times.
Blythe, I have a question about her friend Peter, her compatriot in the movement, later in life developed dementia. And I'm wondering, that would have been a huge additional challenge. Was he cared for within the house for the rest of his life, or what? How did that transpire?
Absolutely. In fact, they also had a couple of agricultural farms in various places, some of which really didn't do very well. And ultimately that, in terms of the New York branch, that ultimately was kind of abandoned by the worker movement. But he died in the late 40s. And he died at one of the farms and was brought back to the house in Manhattan. And typical of the worker, he was buried in a borrowed suit and in a donated grave, and out in Queens. And it was, he just lived his entire life in poverty. But money meant nothing to him. Ideas meant something to him. And Dorothy always said that he was the inspiration for the movement. I think in terms of taking the ideas and making something happen, she needs to have the credit. But she maintains it could never have happened without Peter's ideas. I hope that's answering your question.
No, thank you.
Blythe, this is Duffy Hickey. I'm actually husband of Robin Hickey, who's been in Mark's class. And I was wondering if maybe either of you could respond to what you thought were was the thread that connects Lincoln to King today to Merton that the Pope was referring to.
I think all of them had a passion for justice. And it didn't, in Lincoln's case, and I'm a great admirer of him, of course, but he sort of began life as a pragmatist. And even, some people forget this, but he was known to say at the beginning of the Civil War, or just before the Civil War, he said, if I have to live with slavery in order to keep the Union together, I will live with slavery. That changed in the course of the war. And not only by the Emancipation Proclamation, but also by his passing of the 13th Amendment, he did sort of turn himself around a little bit on the issue of slavery. But this was a moment when the Union could have dissolved. And he just almost by force of will believed that the most important thing this country could do would be to stay together. But he also more and more began to believe in the social justice and how wrong slavery was. Obviously, Dr. King, very much along the same lines. Black people weren't slaves any longer, but they certainly didn't have the rights that they deserved to have. And so he had a passion for justice. I think Thomas Merton, very interested in progressive causes, in his writings and in his life. And then there was Dorothy. So I think they all had this passion for that we as Americans, but also as citizens of the world, that we needed to be working on this. I would say that was the trend line between all of them.
Yeah,
Thank you.
You know, with the exception of Lincoln, who was engaged in a war, King, Merton, and Day were all pretty well solidly against war. Day being a pacifist, I guess her entire life. Was that true? Or that there was also this, how do we achieve social change and do so in a nonviolent way? And she may be following in King's example, or she was before that, but I mean, following in people like Gandhi and all. I don't know really where she was getting her practices of civil disobedience and how she challenged laws that were unjust or things that needed to be changed. I mean, could you say more about that she is a pacifist, and also some of the methods that she really used to kind of push the issue? Civil disobedience, she was jailed so many times, protests, that kind of thing. And interesting that both she and King take up the issue of voting. who gets to vote. For day it was women couldn't vote. So that idea that if people count, they should have a voice.
Although it's ironic, because having gone to jail the first time in her life on the issue of female suffrage, she never voted in her life. She began to think that there was no real difference, no substantive difference between the various political parties. So she never bothered to vote because she didn't think it was worthwhile. But she did, of course, she was part of the group, the radical group that really had been very unhappy about America's entrance into World War I. So I think her pacifism really began then. And she got some pretty significant pushback when she protested later on. The movement protested the war in Spain and our any involvement in that. And then really after Pearl Harbor, she really took a hit. She took a hit, and the movement took a hit. And they had a very significant circulation of their periodical up until the Second World War. And suddenly, after Pearl Harbor, people were not buying that anymore. Everybody thought we had to get involved. And in fact, I must say that there were a number of young men in the movement that, despite their feelings about the movement, did end up serving in World War II because they felt like they had to go. Others did not. Some went to jail. Some went to be part of pacifist camps, if you will, where you didn't have to go to jail exactly, but you had to go and work in these camps that were all over the country. And that's how they got through the war. Some went as medics. And then, of course, later, in terms of things like Vietnam, conflicts like Vietnam, they really opposed Vietnam. And of course, the country finally caught up with them on that issue. But they were out there before anybody else protesting that.
Striking. That's some pretty hardcore gospel values there. Darlene, I see you've got a hand up.
Thanks, Mark. Hi, Blythe.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about Dorothy's views on women in the church, the role of women in the church. I've seen very little written about her views there, so I was just curious.
I think that makes sense, because I don't think that was one of the things that was first and foremost in her mind, truthfully. I think, again, this is the interesting thing about her. She was not particularly interested in the women's movement in the 70s. And she didn't really consider herself a feminist. And of course, it's so interesting because she was such a strong woman in so many ways. But that does not seem to have been one of the issues that really caught her attention significantly. And so my best guess is you haven't read much on this, because that was not particularly a concern for her. In some ways, she was very, very conservative as a Catholic. And then, of course, in other ways, not at all. And that's one of the things that made it really fascinating to learn about her.
It's more like she was radical more than liberal or conservative. It was something else, like radical
Yeah.
Christianity or something.
And it really did depend on the issue. And you know, there, I think about someone like, or Edith Wharton is a great example of someone who never saw the purpose of the suffrage movement, particularly. She just thought, because she had found her own way and was making her own money and had been able to be a successful writer at a time when women were not, she didn't understand why other people needed the help. And I think Dorothy had a little bit of that too.
Nice. We have another question from Anita Hall.
Hi, Blythe, thanks. Is it known if contemplation or contemplative prayer was a part of her life as it was Merton's?
Perhaps not to the same degree, but yes. And in fact, she became in the 40s a very, very interested in what was called a retreat movement. And contemplative prayer was very much a part of that. And she would go off to these sort of pastoral settings and for a week or so, and there would be a lot of prayer involved in these. And I think it was a very much a part of her life. I don't think she, I don't think she had as much time to do it as Merton, who of course was in a much more remote and pastoral setting. But I think to the degree that she could, I think that was very important. I know prayer was particularly important to her, and daily mass, extremely important.
I found it interesting too that, you know, they had all these soup kitchens and residents in the city, and then they went to this you know, this farm environment too, and it seemed like there was a sort of a dynamic there, a relationship of getting out of all of that and resting and growing food, and it seemed like a kind of a natural progression of what they were doing. Made sense in the sense that some of that food would go back to the city, I guess, but also you could get out of the city yourself too and sort of hear yourself think and all.
There seemed to be an inherent problem, however, in that, and I come from a family of farmers, so I know something about farming, and farming is really difficult. And a lot of people went to these places thinking that they were going to be able to sort of sit around and think, or sit around and write, or even sit around and pray. And then there were people who were bringing them the crops and had more than their share of resentment that they were doing all the work, and other people were just sort of walking around being, you know, philosophers. And ultimately, this was a real problem for many years. And as I said, the New York House ultimately had to sort of disengage from these, which was a great disappointment to Peter, who had wanted so much to go back to the land. He thought that that was a very important part of the process. But in practical terms, it didn't work as well as they hoped, because farming is difficult.
Makes sense. We have time for another, I think, one more question. Anybody else have a question or comment?
Why, was there ever a time in Dorothy's later life when she was pulled away from those beliefs and from her devotion to the poor? Was there ever a major temptation period or something? A
No,
crisis for her?
I don't think so. In the last several years of her life, she did slow down. She had pretty significant arthritis. She had pretty significant congestive heart failure. And the last several years of her life, she was more or less confined to the house on the Lower East Side of New York. And this was a great disappointment to her. She wanted to continue to be on the front lines, and she just wasn't in shape to do it. In fact, the last year of her life, she was more or less confined to her room, which was a great sadness to her. But I think in terms of what she believed in, I don't think anything ever changed. In fact, on the last day of her life, she took a phone call, and she was in very poor shape. But she took a phone call from a friend of hers who had gone over to Italy, which had recently suffered an earthquake. And she was talking to her about how this woman, what needed to be done to help the people who were victims of the earthquake. So even on the last day of her life, a few hours before she passed, she was still concerned with other people. I don't think that ever changed. And I don't think her devotion to the church or to God ever changed.
Beautiful.
Okay. I have a question. Do you have time for one more or not?
Yeah, sure. Go. Yeah, go.
Okay,
Claire.
it's a quick one, and it'll display that I don't know much about her. But in the beginning here, it says that that she would go out and raise hell the night before, and then she would go to church and see people praying. You know, the next morning she would go, not to repent any misdeed, but to see if she could fathom what it was the silent worshipers in the pews were feeling, what it meant to pray and seek communion with the higher power. So did she achieve that? Do you think, did she ever talk about that, or was she able to finally hear that higher power or connect with it?
Oh, I think so. I absolutely think so. I think it was tough, as it is for any of us. But I think she had a real, I think she loved what she was doing. As hard as it was, I think she loved what she was doing. She felt her life had a purpose. I think she was totally in step with Matthew 25. And I believe she spoke about the duty of delight, and what, and it was a duty. She saw it as being the duty of everyone, but I also think she truly loved what she had chosen to do, with all of its frustrations and all of the problems. I think I think she was, I think she didn't die satisfied, because she felt there was so much more to do, but I do think she died happy.
Blythe, thank you so much. I wanna thank Deacon Chris for running our technical stuff here and making sure everything held together. And I also again want to thank Kathy and Ralph Williams for facilitating this and making this a great introduction of Blythe to all of us. And Blythe, I want to really thank you for being here, and not just here tonight, but everything that brings you here, and devoting your own work to writing this book and introducing us and having some of us become more familiar with Dorothy Day.
Well, I was very lucky. I just want to throw this in. I was very lucky, because at a certain point in the process, I began to feel like I was drowning, and I was so lucky to be able to bring my friend John Lokery in to help me, who had so much more experience in writing biography. And a lot of the, so much of what he did made it a better book. And I'm so grateful to him. And I hope that those of you who do decide to buy the book will think that we did a good job, because we worked really hard at it.
Yes, well, let John know we're grateful to him as well. And we are certainly grateful to you. And we're grateful to Dorothy Day, who still speaks today. I mean, these principles apply to so much of what's happening today. So it's a true inspiration. And we thank you for opening that up to us and making her come alive for all of us. I also want to thank all of you for being here. It's wonderful to share this evening with you. And I'm going to unmute everybody as we go so that we can just call out goodbye. I once heard a while ago that goodbye is a form of blessing, you know, as we send each other on our way. So maybe we can all at once just say our goodbyes and wish each other well. Blythe, thank you so much.
Amen.
Bye.
Amen.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.